Welcome back. It's time for our final panel of the summit. Space has become big business. Reusable rockets and a sharp reduction in launch costs have made it easier and cheaper to deploy assets into orbit. Tycoons like Richard Branson, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos are all engaged in this new commercial space race. But it's not just about space tourism. It's also about the vast opportunities in satellites and broadband services. To discuss this boom in the business of space, we have a great panel, including Josef Aschbacher, Director General of the European Space Agency, Simonetta Di Pippo, Director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, Dan Hart, President and Chief Executive of Virgin Orbit, Virgin Group's satellite launch service, and Colonel Pam Melroy, Deputy Administrator of NASA. And if you have your own views on this topic, be sure to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #FTGlobalBoardroom. Moderating is our West Coast editor, Richard Waters, who'll be with you very shortly.
Hello from San Francisco. I'm Richard Waters, the West Coast editor for the Financial Times. We're here to talk about commercial space. And when you look across the new tech sectors that have been attracting capital this year in large volumes, commercial space is right up there. I always think of a time like this as it's like a validation of work that's been going on for many years. The commercial launch sector is obviously very well established. The satellite industry is a huge private industry already. But as capital arrives in large quantities, as the public markets get involved, it suddenly attracts a lot of attention, a lot more corporate interest. And I'm delighted here to have a panel of experts who have spent their entire careers in space. And for a lot of us, admittedly myself as well, newer comers to the area, I'm looking forward to learning from your experience about what is achievable, what might be achievable in the years ahead, and what kind of return that capital might hope to expect. So let me introduce first of all our panelists. Josef Aschbacher. Josef is the Director General of the European Space Agency, and he's spent much of his career in Earth observation, helping on the Copernicus project, and more recently running all Earth observation for the ESA. Josef, thank you for joining us. Pam Melroy. Pam, like Josef, moved to her new position this year. She's just been appointed as the Deputy Administrator at NASA. And Pam, thanks for joining us. Since every space panel needs at least one astronaut on it, I'm glad you're here with us. Pam's flown 3 missions. She's one of only 2 women to have commanded a spaceship for NASA. So very much looking forward to learning from your experience. Next up, Simonetta Di Pippo. Simonetta at the, so I'm going to make sure I get your title right, Simonetta, is the Director of the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs. She's had a career coming through the Italian Space Agency and the UN. And since every panel also needs someone who has an asteroid named after them, I'm glad to say there's a Dipipo asteroid out there, somewhere floating out there in the darker reaches of space, right, Simonetta?
Yeah, in the main belt between Mars and Jupiter. Yeah.
There you go. Let's hope it stays out there. And last, Dan Hart, the president and CEO of Virgin Orbit, which got its first launch, its first payload into orbit earlier this year from underneath the wing of a Boeing. So Dan, thank you for joining us. Dan is a former Boeing executive, having spent 3 decades at the company and deeply involved in some of the big private satellite projects of recent years. So, and of course, Virgin Orbit itself is looking to go public through a SPAC. So, Dan, thank you for coming, and glad.
Great to be here. And I don't have an asteroid named after me, so
just
not yet.
It'll come. So, first off, let's just look at the potential here, because some corners of the space industry are already fairly developed. Others, like private habitats and manufacturing in low Earth orbit and asteroid mining sound, further out there. So from where you're sitting, from each of your perspectives, what do you think is the potential here? What is a commercial incentive bring to the space race, if I can put it that way? And other than just putting a lot of money into shareholders' pockets, which maybe it'll do, what else might it bring? Why should we be interested in the commercial dimension in space? Joseph, let me come to you first with that.
No, thanks, Richard, and really happy to be on this panel with so many really distinguished people, with astronauts and asteroids all around us. So really very nice to see that. And also, hello, Dan. No, thanks. What is the prospect, and what are the how do we see it from the perspective of the European Space Agency? As you know, we are, like NASA, a public funded entity. So our interest certainly is to develop the space sector. And in fact, we have learned a lot from our friends overseas, how they are doing it, and how they develop really a very vibrant commercial sector. So what I have done when I joined as DG of ESA on the 1st of March this year, I've put a strategy on the table, and one of the highlighting some priorities of what Europe should be doing in order to really, I would say, make sure that the landscape is giving a good environment for the European space landscape at large, companies, but also the public sector, to make sure that space is at the best service for its people and for its economy. So commercialization is a top priority, is one of the 5 priorities I've outlined. And here it really goes across the board, maybe with the exception of space science to explore our universe and our solar system, but basically in all the other domains, the commercialization really takes hold. Even in space science, some first elements are coming up here. And of course, there are some domains that are much more commercial. Certainly, the satcom market, telecommunications market, broadband internet, as we see it happening every single day. Also, Earth observation, extremely fast in developing commercial aspects, but also in launches. You have mentioned it, is going very fast. So yes, my job really is to help companies to develop commercial businesses with the help of the public sector, and really ensure that we can be at best use of them in order to develop their businesses.
Right, thank you very much. Pam, let me come to you. I mean, obviously NASA has considerable experience now of this kind of new business model around, commercial contracting, and it's been fascinating to watch. Tell me from where you're sitting, what does a commercial dimension bring to your mission?
I think it's really been an extraordinary decade if you look back, and NASA, is very proud of its role. Of course, technology development on rockets and satellites has been going on for decades. And what's happening now, of course, is that private companies are taking that technology and trying to use it in new ways, in more efficient ways, to bring the costs down. So that's a huge benefit to us, bringing the cost down of access to space and the development of other capabilities. In fact, in my view, I think it's one of those things where I look ahead and say, hey, we have an incredible commercial aviation community that has enormous impact on people's lives every day, right? It changes business models, it changes people's access to each other. And I think the exciting thing about commercial space is that it's going to enable NASA, yes, to do our mission more efficiently and more effectively, allows us to focus on the hard things like deep space, which is much more difficult. But what we actually see is the development of commercial space is going to impact everyone as we move forward.
Thank you. Simonetta, let me come to you now. What do you think? What do you think commercial is going to give us?
Well, for sure, the situation and we are facing right now is that there are a lot of areas in which technologies became mature, and therefore it's been always the same trend or path, if you want. So governments start spending money to reach challenging goals, and then technologies become more mature, and then you can see, let's say, commercial sector blooming. This was true for telecommunication a bit ago. Now Earth observation, we are going towards low Earth orbit, more commercial, and for sure, as it was said already, governments will start focusing more. Already did it, but starting focusing more and more on the exploration of the solar system, both robotic and human. Now, one problem that I would like to underline, which may be helpful for discussion also in the panel, is the fact that you cannot develop a commercial safe space if at the same time you don't preserve the space environment. And so the long-term sustainability of outer space activities is not only an issue to keep the space environment clean per se and maintain in this manner the peaceful uses of outer space, or support the maintenance of the peaceful uses of outer space, but it's extremely, I would say, mandatory for developing a commercial safe space so that operators can really be more solid with their business model and their business cases, also to attract investors, etc. So it's a sort of a closed loop, and the two things are going in parallel.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. Finally, over to you. What do you think commercial space is going to bring us?
Of course, we're a product of the excitement and observation that there's so much to do in space, and that private interest and investment can drive progress forward. I mean, as Pam mentioned, space has changed the way we live, and a lot of people don't even realize it. I remember when my kids were little, asking while I was making GPS satellites, why do we need those? We have our iPhones, and they have GPS. Well, they didn't realize they were talking to 2, 3, or 4 satellites at a time when they were looking at that. So, space has crept in. It has changed our lives already. But we're at the point of, maybe where the automobile was at the Model A, where, we were able to do it, but there's so much more potential communication. The Internet of Things will come forward and change the way mobility works and logistics works, and make us more efficient there. Air traffic management needs to be rethought, and we can save an enormous amount of fuel and efficiency in doing that. Earth observation, obviously, understanding our climate. There will be regional pushes, agriculture, industry. There's enormous amount of potential that will continue to make us a more efficient species, and which is what we really need to do, as an overarching humanity. And so, that's what we're all about. What's happening is the way innovation is done and the way projects work is changing with this commercial push. And it's similar to aircraft, when it was moving along fine, and then all of a sudden the mail service figured out in the 1920s and 30s that they could make use of it. And it pushed aircraft capabilities forward. We're going to see the same thing happen with space, and we are seeing it. Innovation is moving forward. It's going to be messy, like any new industry. And it'll change the digital divide. It'll change the way we understand our planet.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. Well, let me come back to something Pam just said. Pam, you mentioned cost. That you're able to do much more with your budgets and focus on the really big mission, the really big things that you want to do at NASA. And to be clear here, when we're talking about commercial, obviously private companies have been involved for many years as contractors, but what's changed here is the contracting model, that you are no longer just paying a company to build something for NASA. You're buying a product or a service off a company that has to build that and then find a market for it. And I guess one question I have is about the markets, how long it will take for new markets to grow around some of these things. As an anchor customer, it's been, I'm going to focus on NASA here, been a tremendously successful relationship, for instance, with SpaceX and Falcon 9. It's brought down the cost of launch tremendously. Markets start to develop around that. So tell us a bit more about what kind of commercial space markets we should be looking forward to here, and how are they going to get, you can see them, but what's really going to give them momentum and get the scale that these commercial companies want? Pam, let me start with you on that.
Right. Well, it's a long-standing market. As Joseph referred to, transportation, right? So it's a great market for commercial in a lot of ways because it's a very clear business model. You understand it if you've got, a schedule and a manifest, and then you build to that, and that's how you can manage your business model. And so for NASA commercial cargo and commercial crew taking cargo to the International Space Station, that's a sustained mission, and it's got a very clear manifest. And we co-invested with our companies in terms of developing the capability. And that also enabled us to stay having insight into the development and insight into the capability, which is especially important when you're carrying crew, right? You have to ensure the safety. And we at NASA had the expertise. And so that partnership during development was really important. So the transportation model, we're starting it again. We've got a program called CLIPS that's about delivering small payloads to the surface of the moon so that, we can start to do science there. Perhaps that'll evolve into, a cargo model where we can pre-position things and so forth. So that's a really solid market. The only hard part about that market is it does happen to be rocket science, which, as Dan will tell you, is as hard as advertised. So, but I think, the success of some companies like SpaceX and Rocket Lab have really caught the attention of investors, and they recognize a sustained potential, and they have a lot of commercial customers now beyond NASA. I think the other big market that's clearly out there is data as a service, and that's everything from remote sensing of the Earth all the way to a couple of companies that are out there pushing internet from space to have connectivity and access globally. And, that's very exciting for rural areas. But if you stop and think about how that could impact, for example, shipping, that's a place that's extremely hard to get that kind of information right now. So I think those are the two very clear business models in the near future.
Yeah, Joseph, I see you nodding. I mean, what do you think the next big markets are? Which ones have the most potential?
Yeah. I think what Pam was saying is absolutely right, and I agree 100% with his statements. But let me just highlight, I think, some segments that will develop extremely fast, and then that certainly is the downstream sector. Downstream sector, Pam was mentioning it, the utilization of data, provision of services from space or with satellites. We have done some socioeconomic estimates of some of our investments. Take Copernicus as an example, but also in the SATCOM market, it's very similar. First, we see a very strong growth in this sector, between 10, 15, in some cases even 18% per year, which is quite remarkable for any economic sector. And I think this is really enormous in the telecom, in the Earth observation part. but also we should realize that that the infrastructure investments we do in satellites create a much bigger downstream market, and this, of course, is a huge benefit. And this is exactly also, I would say, at the juncture where public investments then benefit the commercialization, which is mostly also in the downstream sector, in addition, of course, to some hardware investments. Let me take the case of Copernicus, these socioeconomic models. We have done, they have defined or determined if you invest €1 in infrastructure, you get up to €10 back in terms of socioeconomic value with new services, new companies that are being created, new IT-related activities that are coming out of it. So really, there's a huge multiplier that we see, and certainly SATCOM, Earth observation, are the ones at the forefront of this navigation, obviously, through the terminals and equipment. So yes, these are really the growth sectors we see very strongly, at least in Europe.
Right. Dan, obviously, kind of launching small satellites has become one of the areas we've seen huge innovation from the commercial sector. I don't know how big that market's going to get, but from where you're sitting, what is the potential?
Well, as you point out, I mean, this year was a big year for us. In January, we went to orbit with a dozen satellites for NASA, and we were absolutely delighted to be able to put those gently into orbit, and then watch the researchers do their thing. And then in June, we repeated it with a set of customers from DoD, the first satellite for the Royal Netherlands Air Force, and a commercial company. We're seeing a huge amount of pickup. All the innovation that Josef just brought up requires launch. And so there's a huge amount of push there, and we went about it in a different way, using a 747, and the first time a liquid rocket ever put satellites into orbit. One interesting thing that's happening worldwide is a global interest and drive into space. And so we're seeing space agencies pop up across the world. And we're seeing the desire to have sovereign capabilities or regional capabilities, which is rippling both through the satellite world as well as through launch. And so we're seeing not only the potential in all the areas that were just mentioned, but a multiplying effect, because regions want to have the ability to task their own satellites. They want to have the ability to handle their communication problems. So it's both a global as well as a regional activity, which is exciting for us because we can take any runway in the world, and if it can handle a 747, it can go to space.
Yeah, I mean, Simonetti, you raised the question earlier, and I think we'll get around to talking about this later in the discussion about how one shares, how you share out resources in space and how everybody gets access. But from where you're sitting, what are you seeing in terms of interest, as Dan says, amongst other countries, many more people to get to space? And are government customers going to be the main driver for the commercial space industry for however long we can look at it?
Well, yeah, it's quite a good angle. I mean, the question allows me, your question allows me to mention a couple of things that may be very helpful for this discussion. First of all, we have this Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space that started in '58. So at the very beginning of the space era, when you had only 2 countries able to do something in space. Now we have more than 90 countries overall, out of 193 that we count as the UN, able to send at least 1 satellite in orbit. The last 3, thanks to us, because we are having quite an interesting program called Access to Space for All, where we try to support developing and emerging countries to get there. And clearly in this phase, this is mainly supported by governments because, it's the first step is always like that. But I would like to mention that in the meantime, we reached 100 member states. And this is extremely interesting because the speed at which, we had an increase of more than 30% in terms of membership in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space under my tenure, so in the last few years. And for a committee which was there since '58, it gives you the feeling that member states countries are really understanding the value of space for their socioeconomic sustainable development. So, and this brings then all the discussion about startups, how to support commercial development, in particular in the downstream part, because clearly there are a lot of assets and infrastructures in orbit, but they are owned by a very limited number of countries. The spacefaring countries own satellites in orbit is small, really a small number, but everyone can benefit from GNSS data, Copernicus data, etc. And so application and services can be distributed all over the world. And that's what we do. We support countries to acquire capabilities in analyzing data and developing services and applications for the benefit of their citizens. So downstream is really the part that we are focusing on. But I have to say, the fact that we have so many launches, so many countries, so many new players knocking at the door is a very good sign that the sector is really blooming.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of dig into, what one consequence of this is so many people going up in this kind of race. And, we in the media love to talk about space races, but it does seem that, there are many in many corners and it's quite an exciting time. But it has knock-on effects. And Joseph, I read in the Financial Times this week, I think, your view that allowing this kind of unfettered access to low Earth orbit at the moment does raise questions about access and how we share out this resource, if indeed it is a scarce resource, with initially, obviously, Starlink. SpaceX's Starlink has got nearly 2,000 satellites up there. A lot of people are lining up now to really, get some big constellations going. What kind of problem might this cause, and how are we going to deal with it? Joseph, let's start with you on that one.
No, yes, this interview on the Financial Times did create a bit of an echo, but let me just get one thing right. I think what is happening at the moment in space is really fascinating. We have, you mentioned Elon Musk, but also many others are building up a lot of satellites, Starlink, and it's quite fascinating of how it goes, how fast it goes, the dynamism which comes into the space world. And of course, me being the head of the European Space Agency, it's quite fascinating. And personally, I admire Elon Musk and his space undertakings, both on the rocket side and Starlink. And I've been in SpaceX in Hawthorne, and I have to say, very impressed. It's very, very nice to see. But of course, what this raises is, there are, and you mentioned the example of Starlink, there are a lot of new satellites coming into orbit, and because we do depend so much on satellites these days. It was mentioned before by Simonetta, by Pam, and by Dan, for everything, for weather forecasts, agriculture, fisheries, disaster management, climate change, climate research. So satellites are a very integral part of our daily life, navigation, communication, obviously. And since they are so important, of course, we are very concerned that the space in which they fly, that means outer space, is safe, and there is some measures or regulation, if you wish, to make sure that this is a sustainable use for all the players that need to use these orbits for their purpose. So yes, I think this is what is needed, and this is something that we should really work together. There are different things that need to be done. One is certainly regulation, but also other means like basically cleaning up space. We are having a mission that we develop right now to take out a debris from orbit just by taking it and bringing it out of the orbit of a defunct satellite or a defunct upper stage of rocket. But also in-orbit servicing, everything that contributes to the sustainable use of outer space, I think, needs to be supported. And there we work actually very close also with Simonetta and the United Nations of Outer Space Affairs in order to really ensure a future sustainable use of outer space.
Yeah. Pam, what do you think? Is orbital space a scarce resource, and if so, how should it be shared out?
It is. Sorry, Simonetta, go ahead.
Well, Pam, let's start with you, and James, if you can follow up on that one too.
Well, we'll be very brief, but yes, it is a scarce resource, and yes, we need to protect it. And if you see the projections, of course, of satellites coming into orbit in the future, there will be many more coming. We are at the moment close 3,500 to 4,000, and this will go up very fast. Yes, so we need to take steps in order to protect it and ensure a sustainable use of outer space. Absolutely. Yeah. But sorry, Simonetta, I think you're very qualified to discuss this because this is really in your domain. Yeah.
Let me come to Pam, and then Simonetta will come to you. Pam.
Yeah, I see this from the perspective of history, which is that up until about a decade ago, space users were almost all nation states who were expected to abide by the terms of the Outer Space Treaty and assumed to make, reasonably good decisions, especially, regarding the use of space and, access to space, all those things that were agreed to in the Outer Space Treaty. And even, for example, our, commercial telecommunications satellites were really in a very narrow, highly structured policy and regulatory lane. And so now we see all these new business models, and what's happening is technology is outstripping our policy and regulation. And, we've seen what happens with the internet, right? That's a great example of when, you have unforeseen consequences like, cybersecurity and things like that. So it is really, really important that countries work together and have these conversations, and the UN plays a critical role in that. But we also have many other arrangements. I'd just like to flag the Artemis Accords, which is a series of agreements. They're based off the Outer Space Treaty. They're relatively simple, but they're an important start at agreeing as we push out into the solar system. So yes, we have this very crowded environment in LEO. And if you look in geosynchronous orbit, you actually have to, it's like real estate. You have to apply for a slot for, communications purposes. And so it really is, they're not making any more of it, just like real estate. But as we push out into the solar system, we're going to try to get ahead of that and say, hey, let's have some agreements, which currently are not binding on our commercial partners, but we'd like to see them come on board. So we're trying to think a couple chess moves ahead because we're not in a good place right now.
So this is, sorry, just to follow on that, are you saying that then you're going to use your authority at NASA to put this into agreements with companies to try and control how they're going to be, but you can only do this within the context of your contracts, right? You can't.
That's absolutely correct. And we haven't done that explicitly, but because we're NASA and we signed the Artemis Accords, we will, of course, ensure that any activities that we are funding and overseeing are conducted in accordance with those accords. It's an interesting idea, but we weren't content, I think, to wait and see how it unfolded. But we have great partnerships, European Space Agency, of course, and we have all these discussions. And in fact, I'm happy to say that Mexico signed the Artemis Accords just this morning. So we have a growing set of partnerships. And I think, we're starting with simple things we can all agree on, but it gives us a basis. And also, of course, we'll continue to work with Simonetta's office as well.
Yeah. Well, Simonetta, so before coming to you, by the way, a question from the audience here that's come in has kind of also pointed out that, of course, Russia recently, had a test mission against destroying a satellite, which has really made us all very aware of, the risks here, and again raises the question of whether this means we really need to work harder on some kind of international protocols or agreements. And I would remind the audience, please do post your questions and I'll try and squeeze some in. So, Simonetta, from where you're sitting, obviously the UN did more than half a century ago try to kind of, set the terms for international development of space, but what can be done?
Well, you're right. I mean, it's now a long time that UN is really on top of things in this field. However, yes, indeed, we have the treaties, we have the principles. In 2007, the space debris mitigation guidelines. And very recently, a couple of years ago, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space approved a set of guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. So all of this is there, which means that all member states, since the decisions are taken by consensus, even if this is not binding, I mean, that's not binding rules, but as more soft law, at least when we talk about guidelines, well, member states tend to really stick to the commitments they take when they approve this guidelines. However, there is no let's say mechanism to have any monitoring of what is happening, at least not right now. And so that's the reason why myself, but the entire office is pushing for space traffic coordination and global governance, up to the point that the Secretary General of the UN on the 10th of September this year issued a document called Our Common Agenda, whereas, there are a lot of different topics, but among the main 7 high-level tracks that he wants to deal with in organizing what is called the Summit of the Future in September, which will be organized in September 2023. One is space, but it's space focusing on space traffic management and global governance. Now, you may say that 2 years is really around the corner. Yes, you're right. But it's also true that for us, it's an important milestone, and I believe that this will also help the development of the Inorbit Servicing, let's say, commercial sector. And if I may, just an additional comment on what Pam just said, the Artemis Accords and also other discussions ongoing towards moon exploration is a way of going ahead with the, let's say, activities in parallel at national level. And this is always welcomed. The more than the discussion becomes multilateral, the better it is, because in order to be sure that we can ensure long-term sustainability, we need to have all the players at the same table. And that's extremely important because the moon is unregulated for the time being from the multilateral perspective. And so global governance is really one of the key topics for the future, the near future, if we want to preserve space for future generations.
Given the pace at which things are moving and the competition that's driving this, is it realistic to expect any kind of agreements on global governance in time to really make a difference, at least in some of these kind of initial developments and markets?
It is, yes, if we succeed in doing it in a couple of years, which, considering the fact that you have to to find an agreement among 193 member states, and I would like really to have a multi-stakeholder dialogue, where the private sector, civil society, academia, all of the stakeholders are really say their voices are heard, because requirements and needs are coming in particular from the private sector, but not only. And so we need to find a way of listening to them and help also member states to take the best informed decision possible, hopefully in 2 years from now.
Dan, from where you're sitting, is more regulation needed? Do you need regulation, or do you want the regulators to get out of the way? And I think, Pam, it was, you compared this with the early days of the internet. Is that how you feel? And, are you just basically racing now to establish a business and you'd rather the regulators stay out of the way?
I think the commercial world needs to get behind the 3 leaders on this call. We're in an urgent situation. So I think there's a huge amount of potential for space. We can make space a growing, peaceful, sustainable environment, or we can destroy it, and we can do it quickly. That would be my key message here. I think we need an infrastructure so we know what's going on in space. We need agreements and regulations about how spacecraft operate, perhaps even communicate with each other as well as the ground so that they don't collide. And we need to get rid of the idea of any kind of kinetic weapon being used in space, because it destroys the entire environment. If you look at air travel, there are many, many aircraft that fly every single day, and aircraft are much less predictable than spacecraft. They don't have orbits they follow every single day. So we found ways to keep aircraft from interfering with each other. We can certainly do the same thing in space. The potential is there. We just got to get on with it.
So better traffic management. A question from someone in the audience that kind of touches on a related theme. So sorry, let me just read this. How may all spacefaring nations pledge to reduce and eliminate leaving space junk behind? How can we regulate space and to reduce space junk? And is there a comparison here with the world's oceans? What are the best ways of doing this? Pam, maybe I can start with you. How do we reduce space junk?
Right, yes, on mute there. Space junk. Well, the good news. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you?
Yeah. No. Carry on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I do think, this is obviously an area of great concern. It is really interesting, though. It's important to understand that the Earth does have a natural cleaning mechanism in low Earth orbit, in the very low areas of low Earth orbit, where things eventually deorbit. The really tough things are things that stay in space for years at a time, so at the higher regions of low Earth orbit, and cause problems. I think, we have to have some convergence. I think there is the orbital debris mitigation standard practices that have mostly been codified into law, but I think there's further that we need to go.
No. Anybody else? And I won't come to everybody on these questions now. I'll try and get in as many audience questions as I can at the end. But if anybody has a
comment on, I think there's technology that's interesting that's being developed that will help us remove, the larger pieces. And I think that will be a business. But it'll probably be a government-funded business, because there's not a lot of commercial value in pulling things out of orbit. There are probably lots of mechanisms that can be created that make it attractive, or even put a fee on a piece of space debris. So there's technology that we're using, and our partners are using, or starting to use to do that. There's also technology that's become available to make sure that your system deorbits. There's tethers, there's other solar sails and things that are very interesting that we'll see used. That will help us pull debris out. And overall, I think we as a community need to be designing and developing systems that don't stay in orbit forever. And I think the licensing procedure will be one of the ways that we are incentivized to make sure that we don't do that.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to come on to another audience question here on space tourism. Which is now finally getting off the ground. And the question is, should it be taxed and to make it net to zero? And I guess the question here is about what impact, if it takes off, what impact space tourism is going to have, and whether the pluses and the minuses, and how it's regulated. Any thoughts on that, Joseph? I still saw you nodding to that.
Yeah. No, thanks. Well, space tourism, of course, has I would say, has two sides of the coin. On one side, of course, it creates a lot of technology development, of excitement, good businesses in space, and I think Dan and of course also many others are really benefiting and moving, making huge progress on this. And I think from that perspective, it really creates a completely new fascination, new opportunities, and a new economic zone. On the other side, and there's probably in Europe, as you know, the ecological questions are really discussed a lot here. Also, the sustainability of our undertakings, I think, is key. And certainly what happens in Europe is a lot of consideration on how can you make these investments as sustainable as possible with new propulsion systems that are environmentally friendly in order to minimize impacts on the environment. So certainly we have also a discussion along these lines. So I think you always have to see a bit both sides, certainly on as the European Space Agency, where also we have a very strong sustainability and green agenda as part of our activities. It's something where we would invest in finding sustainable, greener propulsion sources, for example, in order to really make a huge development. So yes, certainly something that is not yet a huge topic in Europe, but will come. But sustainability is going with it, certainly in Europe a lot.
No, all right. I'm going to squeeze in one more of my own questions here before we get to the end. We've got time for one or two more. And it's really about competition, how competition is developing in commercial space. And Pam, maybe I can direct this to you first of all. SpaceX has been hugely successful. NASA and all organizations have to decide where they're going to allocate their budget. You end up then with a situation where Blue Origin says, well, we're not getting our fair share. Too much money is going to one or two providers. And so how do you think about how you support a broad and sustainable industry here? Because it seems kind of a bit crazy for us to be thinking about monopolies in space so early on, when you're trying to create this kind of brand new industry. So how are you approaching that? How are you going to create a nice sustainable industry?
Right. Well, actually, industrial-based considerations are nothing new, right? We've always looked at that. The aerospace industrial base is incredibly important, and of course supports our national security partners as well, not just us. And so we all think about that. I think, in my view, competition is extremely important. It keeps everyone on their toes. We're also learning from companies' different ways of doing things. I think to me, the key thing is to take a look at where the programmatic risk is in what you're doing and allocate that appropriately and say, hey, should the risk be on us because we're doing something that's never been done before? Or should we partner with a company on risk? And the other aspect of this is that we have lots of companies in the pipeline, right? It's not just SpaceX, it's not just Virgin Orbit or Rocket Lab. And so we continue to be what I call an early adopter, right? We had the first payloads on most of these commercial space. We said, hey, it would be great if they make it, but and then we'll have our payload in space, but we're willing to work and partner to encourage an entire pipeline. So that's what we're hoping, and it's going to become a mature market, like any market where companies succeed and they fail and new ones pop up.
Well, on that note, thank you all very much. It's been a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to this 5 or 10 years from now, and we can see just which of these markets have matured and who's still standing. Hopefully, Dan, we'll see you there, and we'll see all of you. So thank you very much indeed.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. A quick overview of the panel. Dan Hart said space has changed the way we live. There's so much more we can do with air traffic management, and space has provided vital Earth observations that's changed the way we understand our planet. Josef Aschbacher said innovation in the commercial sector is robust, but of course, launching is the issue. Simonetta Di Pippo pointed out the Access for Space for All program has been a huge success, and it gets all countries involved and supports economic sustainability models. And Pam Melroy said countries need to work together and coordinate on their space missions. Again, a fascinating discussion. Well, it's been an enlightening and entertaining 3 days, but sadly, we've now reached the end of the Global Boardroom. Remember, professional and corporate pass holders can catch any of the sessions on demand for 90 days. Hopefully, you've been receiving our roundup emails at the end of each day. If so, you may have noticed you can win Amazon vouchers worth 150 British pounds. That's about 200 US dollars. Just by completing the post-event survey. So please take a moment to share your feedback about this event. Okay, I'd like to mention a few people before we sign off. Thank you very much to our partners. Please do check out our partner tab on the website for more about them. To our session moderators and anchors, thanks also to our brilliant speakers who've joined us from all over the world, to our technical and event teams behind the scenes, the amazing New York team here, and most importantly, to you, our audience. It's been great having you with us. We look forward to seeing you again on June 7th, 8th, and 9th next year for Global Boardroom number 5. Stay safe and well. Thank you and goodbye.